Mm, interesting. Very interesting.
The American identity,
You,
indigenous allies, celebrating a harvest that promised survival in a strange land.
you.
But beneath roasted turkey and pumpkin pie lies something dark, something far more unsettling.
Oh yeah.
Across the Atlantic in search of freedom did not find peace, found hardship, death, and fear.
Totally awesome.
In the night belonged to the devil lurking in the woods.
Hmm.
The people followed shortly after, obsessed with purity's punishment, determined to carve a city of God into the unforgiving wilderness. They saw the new world not but as a battleground.
Mm.
Step out of line could be in league with the devil himself.
Awesome.
Talking classrooms. On the surface, it is a story of conquest, religious extremism, and violence. It is the tale of settlers who thanked God not just for survival, but for the slaughter of entire communities. It is a legacy shaped by the fear of witches, the need
Awesome.
and the belief that blood and suffering could the favour of heaven be won. The violent origins of early Thanksgivings, witch hunts that gripped the
Uh,
villagers, the Pilgrims behind northern traditions. They planted the seeds of fears. What grew from those seeds still shapes the nation and the stories we tell ourselves. Thanksgiving's origins, far from simple, are tangled in the darkest corners of history, and those shadows are where we're headed next.
mm,
September 20,
mm,
Plymouth, England, aboard the Mayflower, a ship not built for such a voyage, but pressed into service by a desperate fate. 102 men, women, and children huddled in the stinking darkness, tossed by storms and plagued by sickness. They carried more than trunks and provisions.
mm,
Law, applying it with treason.
mm.
Bishops and kings demanded worship as they saw fit. To King James I, their defiance was more than heresy. It was
Mhm.
began seeping into their children's lives, diluting the identity they
Through secrets.
generations. So they decided to leave it. This time, rebuild their covenant with God from the ground up. It was not the smooth crossing they had prayed for. Storms clawed at the ship, cracking beams and soaking their food supplies with brine. Seeking fortune was thrown out. At last,
Mhm.
ship
Cool.
was no accident. It was a sign that God had not abandoned them. 66 days adrift.
666.
Fertile lands of Virginia and but in the barren cold of Cape Cod. Dropped anchor in November 1620, greeted not by opportunity, but by an unforgiving landscape. The soil was rocky, the forests unfamiliar, and winter was already closing in. It left them stranded, forced to build a soon enough. I did not always
Mm-hmm.
people, wiped out by a plague of explorers. The pilgrims stumbled upon their abandoned village, still partially sown, and cached
Yep.
the frost. They took what they could, knowing that every handful of grain might be the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
With a vengeance, William Bradford, who would later lead the colony, described it as a time of misery and death. Disease claimed half their Governor John Carver succumbed before spring swept the ground. The dead were buried hastily, and the living counted themselves among the damned, not knowing if they would last to see another sunrise. Only 7 of the original settlers remained healthy enough to care for the dying. Graves were dug at night to hide their losses from any
Mm.
watching. To the survivors, it seemed as though they were being tested. Every death, another trial by God's hand.
Damn.
People felt like more than chance. To those who remained, it was a covenant fulfilled. God, in his divine wisdom, had led them to this place, cleared the land of its former inhabitants, and ensured that the pilgrims would inherit it. Each hardship became another thread in the story they told themselves, that they were chosen to suffer, and through suffering, to conquer. The land, they believed, had been prepared for them, but the promised land had been given to the Israelites. In March 1621, their luck, or fate, shifted. English to communicate. He returned with Tisquanto, or Squanto,
Wait out.
who had survived capture, slavery, and loss, only to return to find his people gone.
Yep.
Squanto, the pilgrims would interpret as divine intervention, taught them how to plant corn, fertilize the soil with fish, and trap beavers. The pilgrims would not have survived another winter. That autumn, the settlers held a feast of Thanksgiving. They were joined by Massasoit, the subject
Mm.
of his men. But even as they celebrated, the alliance between the two groups was uneasy. For Massasoit, this gathering was not a friendship, but a strategic decision, an alliance born out of necessity, as he sought to strengthen his position against rival tribes.
Interesting.
Still hung by a thread. Their gratitude was real, but so was the fear of what lay ahead in a land still full of unknown dangers. The first Thanksgiving is remembered as a moment of peace. It was fleeting,
Mm.
much harder. The pilgrims had come in search of freedom. The price of freedom would soon become clear. Survival demanded expansion, and expansion would lead to conflict. Gratitude alone could not build a colony. Something sharper would be needed. The pilgrims had secured their survival, but the community built would soon evolve into something far more rigid and expansive. What began as a fragile colony of refugees would in time align itself with a stricter, more dogmatic movement. Puritans. The Pilgrims were separatists, small in number and focused on creating a religion even for their own congregation. The Puritans, by contrast, were a larger, more organised faction of Protestant reformers.
Mm.
The Church of England, Puritans sought not separation but purification, an effort to reform the Anglican Church from within. When the climate in England worsened, many Puritans fled to the New World, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. John Winthrop, they on a hill, a model of moral purity. But these two settlements, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay,
Mm.
the Pilgrims of Plymouth remained more tolerant and pragmatic than their Puritan counterparts. The growing presence of Puritan leaders gradually shaped the cultural and political landscape of the region.
Ridiculous.
The two communities shared a common outlook that they were chosen by God to bring order to the New World, and that influence, whether from indigenous people or dissenters within their own ranks, was a
Mm.
threat. Expansion became essential, not just for survival, but for dominance. As more Puritan settlers arrived, they pushed inland, establishing towns and claiming land already inhabited by native peoples.
Mm.
With the Pequot, a powerful tribe that controlled trade along the Connecticut River. Trade disputes, competition over alliances with other tribes, and Puritan demands for land set the stage for conflict. What had begun as small skirmishes escalated into a full-blown war in 1637.
Indigenous. Mm.
The Puritans decided it was time to put an end to the Pequot threat once and for all. They aligned with the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, who had their own grievances with the Pequot.
Really? Oh, how did they do?
26th, Captain John Mason and his men, along with native allies, surrounded a Pequot village near the Mystic River. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Puritans set the village ablaze, trapping the Pequot inside. As the fire raged, they stood outside the walls, cutting down anyone who tried to escape. By morning, more than 400 Pequot lay dead. Men, women,
Cow.
Narragansett, horrified by the slaughter, protested
Oh,
that
don't.
warfare was supposed to be waged. But to the Puritans it was divine justice. John Winthrop, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, later declared a day of thanksgiving, not for peace, but for victory. The smoke rising from Mystic had become, in their minds, a sense that God had judged in their favour. The Puritans saw the massacre not as an atrocity, but as a step toward establishing a godly society in a land they believed had been given to them by divine right.
Mm.
Thanksgiving was no longer a simple harvest celebration. It had become a ritual of power.
Nice.
The crops they planted and the houses they built were all sanctified by the blood of their enemies. Peace, they believed, could only be secured through domination. And with more reason to give thanks. Thanks not only for what they had, but for what they had taken. Between the autumn feast of 1621 and the massacre at Mystic in 1637, the New England colonies had grown from fragile settlements into expanding territories governed by a theology of conquest. The cooperation between Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay paved the way for future colonial expansion, as both Pilgrims and Puritans embraced a vision of divine destiny. Gratitude was
Mm.
it was bound to violence, as victory in war became a sign of divine approval. The massacre at Mystic was a turning point, not just for the Puritans, but for the future of colonial America.
Awesome.
Survival, the celebration of conquest.
Mm.
From this point forward, expansion would mean more bloodshed, and each new Thanksgiving would be another chapter in a story written with fire, musket balls, and
Mm.
demanded nothing less.
Get my hand.
Puritans believed that life itself was a trial, a narrow path between salvation and damnation, flanked on all sides by the devil's snares. Every thought, every action, every impulse was weighed in the eyes. It invited not just shame, but eternal punishment. Sin was not a private flaw. It was a contagion, a spiritual disease that spread through families,
Mm.
communities, nations. They lived in constant fear that even the smallest transgression could invite divine wrath, illness or ruin upon them all. This was a theology of terror,
Mm.
but also vengeful, and his anger could be kindled by pride, deceit, or even joy taken too freely. Puritans taught that humanity was born in sin, for hell unless redeemed.
Mm.
Filled with temptation and treachery. Every strange from the forest. Every dawn was a land. It was a place where the forces of darkness seemed to gather, waiting to strike. To the indigenous peoples, though often allies, were seen through the lens of the fall. Souls untouched by Christian redemption was considered a state of moral corruption. Aspect. The physical and spiritual
Awesome.
was believed to walk freely,
Ooh,
luring salvation into darkness. Every aspect of life in the New World became a moral
a
test.
cup of Joe.
Crop was not just a misfortune, it was a sign that sin had taken root. Fever in the night could mean more than illness. Someone had fallen from grace. Children were especially vulnerable. Souls easily swayed by vanity, curiosity, and defiance. Parents were warned to watch their offspring closely, lest they unwittingly become tools of the devil. Puritans lived in fear of God.
Mm.
And sought to use their doubts and desires to lead them astray.
Nice.
The Puritans, even joy carried a dangerous edge. Laughter, dance, or unguarded pleasure could give the devil a foothold. To survive in this wilderness, to tame it, they needed to be not only industrious but pure. They saw themselves as soldiers in a spiritual war, their settlements outposts of God's kingdom in enemy territory. The wilderness beyond their villages was both literal and symbolic, a metaphor for the human soul. Just as the forest needed to be cleared and cultivated, so too did their souls need to be disciplined and purified. Their worldview demanded constant vigilance. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a battle for the eternal fate of their souls. A storm could be more than weather, it could be punishment. A negative fortune might be a sign of secret sin. Every small act mattered, every choice carried the weight of cosmic consequence. It was not enough to survive, they had to this. The devil was always at the door.
Awesome.
Confined to the pulpit,
Mm.
it shaped their punishments and their relationships. Civil infractions, missing church, working on the Sabbath, gossip, were not just breaches of social order, they were offences against God himself. Those who transgressed could expect harsh punishments, not only for their own sake, but to cleanse the community as a whole. Public humiliation, fines, and even execution were seen as necessary to protect the colony from divine wrath.
Right.
John Walton and increased Mather warned of the dangers of spiritual complacency, reminding their flock that Satan was cunning and relentless. A place that would suffer without hope of mercy. Together, and a single one could condemn them all. Thus, they were responsible for their own salvation, for the purity of their neighbours. They created a society built on suspicion, an uneasy alliance between fear and faith. Everyone watched everyone else, searching for signs of weakness or hidden sin. That step could mark you as an outcast, a gateway through which the devil might enter. This obsession with purity and control turned every day into a reckoning.
Yeah, cool one.
An endless struggle to remain righteous in a world filled with unseen dangers. Fear gave the Puritans a kind of power, an conviction that they were sources of light in a world shrouded.
Mm-hmm.
Was a source of
Mm.
fear against the unknown. They believed that God was watching, and if
Mm.
he would guide them through every hardship, just as he had brought them to this wilderness. But if they faltered, if sin took hold, wrath would be swift and unforgiving. It was this constant fear, this relentless battle for purity, that defined their existence. Tempting
Mm.
abstract fears. They were the air the Puritans breathed, the ground they walked upon, rich to their children. And before fear turned to suspicion. suspicion and suspicion to blood. Found a spark in the figure of Bridget Goody Glover. She was an Irish Catholic, foreign in both faith and manner, a woman out of place among the stern Puritan flock. She embodied side of foreign prayers and beliefs. Creed. She was control. Her trouble fortune, John Goodwin, a devout Puritan, fell ill. They became afflicted with strange fits, convulsing, babbling, and contorting their body as though holy. Her presence into their home. Was found in trials by Puritan ministers to the of the body, but attacks on the soul. Glover was dragged into the public on trial. She's stumbling over the language of her accusers. When questioned, she muttered Catholic prayers, familiar to her but incomprehensible to the Puritans. The people of Boston saw her prayers not as pleas to God, but as dark incantations. It confirmed what they had suspected long. She was the devil. Admitted that she had quarrelled with the Goodwin children, but she insisted she had harmed no one. It did not matter. Cotton Mather, one of the most influential Puritan ministers of the time, attended the trial and later wrote that Glover's soul belonged to a company of demons. Her Catholicism made her alien, her Irishness made her suspect, and her defiance sealed her fate. She was guilty, not just in their courts, but in their theology. The devil had a voice in Boston, and it spoke with an Irish accent. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Her execution.
Damn.
What the Puritans believed to be dark magic.
Awesome.
Her refusal to confess her sins only deepened their conviction that she was lost beyond redemption, a servant of hell.
Awesome.
She died not just as a witch in their eyes, but as a warning, a reminder that the devil's influence could take root anywhere.
Nice.
But even did not soothe the colony's nerves. The children's afflictions continued, undeterred by Glover's execution. To the one thing, the devil's grip on the colony. Glover's trial was merely the beginning. Witchcraft
Awesome.
would continue to fester in the minds of the faithful. Suspicion lingered in every street and home, spreading quietly, like frost creeping beneath the floorboards. The trial of Goody Glover stands as a precursor to what would erupt 4 years later in Salem.
Nice.
Fault lines in Puritan society, the growing fear of outsiders, the terror of the unknown, and the ease with which the community could turn on those who didn't belong. This trial was a signal that the Puritans had grown uneasy, that their role had outstripped their grasp on reason. They forced Goody Glover into the role of a scapegoat, but her death was not enough. The fear she embodied, the fear of the foreign, the uncontrolled, would only grow. Soon, it would reach a fever pitch. What prayers in a broken accent, gallows, skies. By 1692, fear had taken root deep in the soil of New England, spreading like ivy through Puritan minds. The trial of Goody Glover had been a warning. The devil,
Damn.
disguised in plain sight, using their unholy powers to corrupt the faithful. It started as suspicion soon became wildfire. In the isolated village of Salem, paranoia blossomed into hysteria, and the flames of that hysteria consumed everything in their path. Most calamities do. 2 young girls, Becky Paris and Abigail Williams, fell ill in the home of Reverend Samuel Paris, the town's minister. They writhed and screamed, their bodies unnaturally. No doctor could explain names. enslaved woman who served the Paris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had long been the subject of gossip. Of the villagers, it was not fever or madness, it was witchcraft
Nice.
slipped through their doors.
Awesome.
Accusation spread faster than any illness, fear and envy. To become a witch was to cast off suspicion from yourself. It wasn't long before dozens of villagers stood accused of pacts with the devil,
Nice.
poisoning livestock, cursing children, and bringing ruin to the community. Husbands named wives, neighbors, and children cried out against their elders. Every misfortune became evidence. An unchurned batch of butter, cow gone dry, a child taken by fever. The trials themselves were theatre, a grim performance of religious extremism dressed in the language of law. Judges relied on spectral evidence, the alleged visions of spirits sent by the accused to torment the living.
Awesome.
Screamed in court, writhing on the floor, claiming to see invisible claws and demons sent by the witches standing before them. Their testimony carried more weight than reason. When Tituba confessed under duress, wild tales of witches' sabbaths and of conspiracies, the villagers' worst fears were confirmed. The devil was in the midst. The noose was swift. Bridget Bishop, the first to be tried and convicted, was hanged that June.
Nice.
17 more had followed her to the gallows, their bodies left dangling as warnings to those who dared stray from the righteous path. Giles Corey, an elderly father, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing. His words, more weight, would echo through history as a defiant rejection of the madness overtaking the town. The community tore itself apart. Accusations crossed every
Awesome.
boundary.